We've been studying from the 21st chapter of Acts, and it's an interesting chapter. But before we get back to that, just for a moment, let's kind of catch up so we know where we're at. But in chapter 21, it starts with Paul leaving Miletus, and he goes to Kos, and then to Rhodes, and then to Patara. You know, Luke just mentions these cities, but these cities were actually, they were great cities. We would call them industrial cities. They did everything from boat building to materials of all kinds, foodstuffs. And he went through those cities, or sailed to those cities on his way back to Jerusalem. And then from Patara, he sailed 400 miles. I think we talked about this last week. 400 miles to Tyre. 400 miles in the open sea. This for 400 miles. That would be gentle, by the way. And then he went to, when he got to Tyre, they offloaded. He went down to Ptolemais and spent a day with the disciples there. Then he went on to Caesarea, where he spent 7 days with those disciples. And then finally, he went to Jerusalem with the gift that he was bringing for the church at Jerusalem. Plus, he wanted to preach there. In all, in the 3 missionary journeys that Paul went on, he traveled just short of 10,000 miles. And he's got another 2,200 miles to go when he sails from Caesarea to Rome. So he was a well-traveled guy. So we went through, and I'll pick this up in just a minute because someone asked me a question. Let's go to verse 18. We'll start there.
What chapter?
21. Well, let's see. We're going to be a little early here, but that's okay. So someone asked me last week, because it says, and the following day, Paul went in with us to see James, and all the elders were there. So this nice young lady asked me, was James an elder? If he was, there's no evidence of it. None. And you would think that Luke would have mentioned that James was an elder. But what James was a pillar, an intelligent young man, and a leader of the church in Jerusalem, as well as the Lord's brother. He did prophesy. But as far as being an elder, there's no evidence that he was. He was married. In 1 Corinthians 9:5 it says, do we, Paul speaking of himself, have the right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles, and the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? So we know that he was married. Not a lot after that, but he was not, in my opinion anyway, in all that I've studied, an elder. So Paul greets the church, pulls them all together and greets them, and he tells them about, I know that's a little ahead of schedule. That's my fault. About all that happened in Europe, about the conversions and how strong the churches were. And he tells this and relates this to the brethren there in Jerusalem. And when they heard this, we talked about this last week, this is still just a bit of a review. When they heard this, they began to glorify God, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are zealous for the law." Thousands indicates a whole bunch of people. Just how many that is, I don't know. Reading from the American Standard Bible Encyclopedia, They thought that somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people lived in Jerusalem on those times where there were no festivals going on, and that there were 70 elders. 70 elders would, in my mind anyway, dictate a whole bunch of people. So the question was asked, if you've got, let's say you've got 8,000 people, 8,000 Christians, which would probably be too many for Jerusalem, but let's just say that. Where would they meet? Where would 8,000 people meet? You think we could get 8,000 in here? Be a little crowded. Outside Jerusalem, there was a theater, which held between 20 and 25,000. They could have met there. They did meet from house to house. There was also a hippodrome. They could have met in there. So they had places to meet. And then he says, they're all zealous for the law. They were zealous for their traditions, and they had more traditions than they had laws. There are 613 laws in the law of Moses, and they had more traditions than that. And they were zealous for those things. Zealous means fervent, passionate, enthusiastic. They were all those things for the law. But Paul taught every time he went into synagogue, he met people who were zealous for the law, Jews who were zealous for the law. And in every synagogue, he told them that the law has been fulfilled. Remember, Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets. I came to fulfill them. And on the day that Jesus was crucified, the law got nailed to the cross right along with our Lord. But it existed, I'm going to say, for another 33, 34 years. They coexisted, Christianity and Judaism, about 34 years. Pardon me?
I believe it was 40 years.
Depends on when you think Jesus was born. He was born, in my opinion, about 6 BC. So if he started preaching when he was 30, it would have been up in the 20s. And then from when he was died, let's say he died in 28 AD to 70 AD, those two existed together. But I won't argue with you.
Yeah, but the destruction of the temple was in AD
70.
which was approximately 40 years after 30 AD, if that being the time that the church was established.
If it was established at 30, I think it was probably established a little bit earlier than that. But
So that would have been more than 40.
no, let's say,
If,
did I write this down? Oh no. If Jesus was born in 6 BC and he started preaching when he was 30, that would make that 24 AD. He preaches for 3 years, 3.5 years. That goes up to 27, right? The year 27? Say so from 27 or even 28 to 70 is 32, 33
no,
years.
42. Your math is off.
Right, 38,
Your
48.
math is off.
You're right. I'm sorry. You're right.
Calculator?
And of course, I didn't write that down. And I went like this a couple of times. But then Judaism ended in 70 AD, and it hasn't existed ever since. So these people were zealous for the law, but they were concerned, the elders were concerned that here Paul is in Jerusalem, and he's walking around and people are going to see him. And they're going to think, well, here comes this guy who preaches that the law is dead and that you don't have to be circumcised and you don't have to observe all these holy days. What's to be done? So they come up with this idea. Now, Paul was already keeping a vow. He took a vow in Caesarea. Don't ask me what the vow was, because I don't know. And because Luke didn't think to write it down, or didn't think it was important to write it down. So the elders say, you know what? We've got 4 men over here who are also keeping a vow. So Paul, why don't you just take them? And in verse 21, it says, what then shall be done? They'll certainly hear that you're here. Therefore, do this that we tell you. we have 4 men who are under a vow. So here's these 4 men under a vow. We don't know what their vow is, but they got 4 people who are going to go through this ceremony for keeping their vow. Bill?
Yeah, did we talk last week a bit about the circumcision thing? That's kind of a bit confusing. I think maybe we might have. Because here it doesn't say that Paul said they didn't say here that, they're not saying, Paul says they can't be circumcised. What it says specifically, what's in your version, mine says, telling them not to circumcise their children. There's a bit of a difference there.
But he didn't tell them that.
No. But he did say, over like in Galatians 5, that if you receive circumcision, and I believe there it's talking about so as to be justified, that you're severed from Christ. So I think we did talk about that last week. So there is a fine line there between people being circumcised back at this time, perhaps just as a custom, like often is done today, and them doing it and saying you have to be circumcised to be justified.
But circumcision was part of the law.
It was part of the law, right? But if they were to obey that law and say we have to do it to be justified, that they would be transgressing God's will for the right.
And that's precisely what they were doing.
I don't know if you know for sure from this context, do you?
Let's go back to Acts 15, 1 through 5.
They
where
were,
the
sure.
Pharisees said you have to be circumcised in order to be saved.
Right.
That was their understanding.
Hopefully the Christians here that is in this context weren't teaching that, because they would have been transgressing God's new commandment.
Right.
So, I mean, they were concerned that Paul was saying, don't do any of these things, which he wasn't saying that.
Here's what I read last week, so I'll read it again.
Okay.
Okay, take notes now. It says, "Thou teachest to forsake Moses. From anything that appears in the course of this book to the contrary, this information was incorrect. We do not find Paul preaching thus to the Jews. It is true that in his epistles, some of which have been written before this time, he showed that circumcision and uncircumcision were equally unavailable for the salvation of the soul, and that by the deeds of the law no man could be justified. But he had not yet said to any Jew, forsake Moses and do not circumcise your children. He told them that Jesus Christ had delivered them from the yoke of the law, but they had as yet liberty to wear that yoke if they pleased. He had shown them that their ceremonies were useless, but not destructive, and that they were only dangerous when they depended upon them for salvation." That's what Paul taught. And some of these people were probably still hung up on circumcision and keeping some of the festivals because it had been part of their culture. It would be like us not partaking of the 4th of July. I mean, we all have picnics and fireworks on the 4th of July. Well, to them, that keeping the law was about the same thing. So he said, what then is to be done? It will certainly hear that you have come, and therefore do that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and all will know that there is nothing to this thing which they have been told about you, but that you yourself walk orderly in keeping the law. So they tell Paul, you're keeping a vow. Here's 4 other guys who are keeping a vow, and we don't know what those vows are. I told you last week, I think, that they were not a Nazirite vow. And the reason for that is simple, that if they're Christians, they partake of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. And if you're a Nazirite, you couldn't have anything to do or eat anything from a grapevine, either the grapes, raisins, or the juice. So I don't think they were keeping a Nazirite vow. I think they were just keeping another vow, and we can all guess as to what that might be. And your guess would be as good as mine because we're not told. So Paul does that. Just a minute here. Let's turn the page. So he says, pay their expenses for this purification. And why would Paul need to be purified? Probably because he was in foreign lands and they thought he was probably defiled. So it says, take them, purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses for the sacrifices, so that they may shave their heads. And all will know that there is nothing to this thing which we have been told about you, but that you yourself walk orderly. So Paul is going to take these 4 men, pay for their purification, pay for the sacrifice, and then they could have their heads shaved. And all goes well. They purify themselves. It's a ceremonial purification. Paul pays their expenses for the sacrifice. And Luke inserts in here, but concerning the Gentiles who I believe we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication. This was something for the Gentiles. This keeping the vow and the purification was Jewish.
What verse are we in?
We're in verse 25. So if I do this, you'll be up with me. But concerning the Gentiles who have been, okay. Then Paul took them in, and on the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one. So they purified themselves, and I think it was the 7 days they had to wait, I think. And then they could make their sacrifice, and they would have their hair cut. And then it would be over. So verse 26, Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. So their days of purification were all but up. They told the priest that it's time for the sacrifice, and then they'll cut their hair and their vow will be over. But this story ends right there. We don't know if they did that or not. It abruptly ends. Because in verse 20, nice picture. This is the temple. But this right here, come on. Oh, well. That area with the big tall thing here, that was the fortress of Antonia. And that's where the Romans stayed. So if there was going to be a riot or somebody misbehaving, the Romans were right there. And there were 1,000 of them. And I break this every time. And in the temple, there were actually 3 sections. There was a Jewish section. That would have been the section probably that Peter and John taught in. It would have been over here. Oh, wait a minute. Let's do this. That came up just like that. Pen. This would have been, it would have been over here. It fell off. Okay. There was a Jewish section back under here. There was a women's section over here, and there was also a Gentile section. So women had their own area, the Jewish men had their own area, and then Gentiles could come in and visit the temple as well. When Titus saw the temple, Titus, the man who wound up destroying Jerusalem, when he saw the temple, he said it's the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He was impressed. And it must have been impressive. All the gold and the marble, and if the sun was out, it would be shining off that marble. It would be hard to look at. But through all that, here sat the fortress of Antonia, where there were Romans, and lots of them. So from verse 26, They're getting ready to complete their days of purification. They're going to make a sacrifice. They're going to have the haircut. Their vow's going to be over. But the story ends right there. We don't know if we don't know what happened to them. What happened to the 4 guys? Did you raise your hand, Mike? Yes, no?
This just, it continues.
No. And if you look in your Bible, you'll start a new paragraph. But when the 7 days were almost over, so now it's almost time to make the sacrifice and get your hair cut, Jews from Asia came upon, when the days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, him being Paul, began to stir up the crowds and lay hands on him. Lay hands on him is another way of saying roughing him up. Crying out, "Men of Israel, come to our aid. This man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place, and besides, he's even brought Greeks in." Oh no. He's even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they previously had seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. They supposed. That's a great big supposed. So these men from Asia, Ephesus, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Paul all had dealings with them when he was there preaching. They see him. Hey, that's that guy right there. And they pounce on him and they begin to beat him up. Lay hands on means, at the very least, slap him around. It would probably be worse than that. And then on top of that, to make a big scene, they said, "Men of Israel, all you Jews, come here and give us a hand. This guy is our enemy. This man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people, the law in this place," which is all a lie. He did not. And besides that, he's even brought Greeks into the temple. Oh no. And he has defiled this holy place. You know, there's a proverb that says, God hates a lying tongue. Bill.
I was going to say, fake news is not something just in our generation.
Oh, of course not.
Right? They were misrepresenting what Paul did back then, just like it happens today. People misread, and sometimes on purpose, sometimes they just don't check into it and get the facts, right?
This was on purpose. You know, you would think if you were just a Jew and you were watching him, you'd see that he wasn't doing anything wrong, and that Trophimus wasn't with him. But they wanted so much to kill this man and to kill what he was saying, they would go to almost any extremes. So they also charged him with bringing Trophimus into the temple. There are actually 4 things that they charge him with. They charge him with disrespecting the Jewish nation, teaching all are the same, and circumcision and uncircumcision are of no account. They were hung up on circumcision. It was a big deal. And to say that it doesn't count, it just didn't hit them. They didn't want to believe it. They charged him with teaching that the law had ended and they must confess Christ as Lord. Is that true? Did the law end? Everybody go like this. Yes, it ended. It ended when it was nailed to the cross, although it existed until 70 AD when Jerusalem was utterly and totally destroyed. Mike? Go ahead. Oh, wait.
It didn't end, it was fulfilled, but that's
Yeah.
Circumcision was much more to them than the idea of being saved or not being saved. Circumcision to them was the boundary of who was considered their people or not their people. And not only did that have, the social implications of who you would associate with and who you wouldn't associate with, the individuals, the people who are at the top of the temple, the high priest and all that, they have a banking system based on the temple and the circumcised and the uncircumcised. And obviously, if you were circumcised, then that was something that you were qualified to be part of. But if you tore that all down, then who controlled those things? No, they had no control over those things anymore, of course. So, and that's the same thing we're seeing today. It's not just that people disagree. They look beyond that and they see, well, if that's the case, then that's going to have these other implications in society. And I think, it is true that Paul was teaching that circumcision and uncircumcision don't have a bearing on salvation, but that was almost like a pretext for some of these other things that were very, powerful.
Circumcision was almost like the initiation into the club.
Right.
When I put it away. And the Jews looked down on people who were not circumcised, on the Romans and the Greeks. They thought them filthy pagans. It's funny that, because the Romans thought the same thing of them. But, okay, I'll hold my thought. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, and it can be kind of confusing because back in Acts 16, Paul actually circumcised Timothy so he could take them and preach and teach the Jews.
It was a convenience.
He wasn't compelled to do it. He did it to have influence, right?
Right.
He became a Jew to a Jew type thing. But over in, where's the passage that it says that when Paul went to Jerusalem, they did not compel him to circumcise Titus.
Right.
And
that was at the Jerusalem Council.
Yeah, Galatians 2. Thanks, Don. So depending on the circumstance, again, whether it was they're saying, yeah, you got to circumcise Titus if you want for him to be saved, and he wouldn't give into that, but he was willing to circumcise Timothy as an influence. So it's a fine line there, and it can be kind of confusing sometimes.
If you were to go to Israel today, and some of the people I worked in the central area were Jewish and they were devout about that. If you were to go to Israel to work, you would be compelled to be circumcised, because if you weren't, they wouldn't have anything to do with you. You're subhuman. And I think that's the way they looked at the Romans and the Greeks. Although the Romans and the Greeks looked at them that way. It always amazes me that the Jews, since 63 BC, were under Roman control. They were slaves to the Roman Empire, and yet they thought themselves superior to the Romans, and they were their slaves. Anyway, so they charge him with 4 things. Let's see, they charge Paul with teaching against the temple, and that men can pray anywhere. And he also possibly taught that the temple would be destroyed. This beautiful. Did Jesus say something about the destruction of this beautiful building? Not one stone. And the wall that was left that held the whole thing up, is now called the Wailing Wall, and there it is. But here's and besides all that, he was accused of bringing Greeks, that's plural, into the temple grounds. Of course, he didn't do that, but they lied and said he did. There's a penalty to be paid if a Gentile were to go into the Jewish section of the temple. And that penalty was death. And the Romans allowed it. If this were true, bringing a Gentile into the Jewish area, if this were true, then the man in question would have been executed. Furthermore, there were notices all around the temple that if a non-Jew would enter the Jewish section, they would be killed. And the Romans allowed this. The sign read, "No person of another nation to enter within the fence and enclosure around the temple." That means all of us would have to stay out. But we could look at the temple and see it. But only Jews were allowed in the Jewish section. And of course, as was the case, then all the city was provoked. Jerusalem was not a huge place, so if there was a riot going on at one end of the city, you would probably hear it at the other end because Jerusalem was just not very big. I think someone figured out it was something like 139 acres. That's about 2/3 the size of Disneyland. If anybody's been to Disneyland and walked that, it's about 2/3 the size of that. So it must have been just packed. So then the city was provoked, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple. They didn't do it gently. They didn't say, "Come with me." They laid their hands on him, roughed him up, and drug him out of the temple. And immediately the doors were shut. That's why I don't think the four guys who were having holding it to the vow ever got a chance to complete it because the doors of the temple were shut. And while they were seeking to kill him, so let's be upfront about what their job was. They wanted to kill him. A report came to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. People running this way, people running that way, somebody saying this, somebody saying that. My dad used to say that as I run around with a chicken with his head cut off. Came to command to a Roman cohort, and all Jerusalem was in confusion. At once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them, and when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating him. We don't want to beat him now because they're going to beat us. The Romans didn't play around. And it seems to me, just as a thought, every time we meet a Roman, whether it was Cornelius or whether it's this guy Claudius Licentius, they seem to be nice guys. I mean, they have a compassionate part to their personality, and he's going to show that. The commander here is going to show that he had a gentle side to him. And he got a little more gentle when he found out he was a Roman citizen. Go ahead, Mike. Mike.
Something just caught my attention when Jonathan and I were reading this not too long ago. I think it was Jonathan and I, but it says, when they saw the commander, so he's coming, right? He and his soldiers are approaching, and they stop beating Paul. And I didn't pick up on it until Acts 24, 25. Whenever they're talking to Festus or Felix or one of those guys, and the Jews are making accusations against Paul, they accuse Claudius Lysias, the commander, of taking Paul from them with much violence. And they're liars anyway. They lied about other things, right, too? But this doesn't at all look like that the commander had to take it with violence. They stopped. So I just threw that out because I've never seen that before, and you'll get to it eventually.
Eventually. Yeah, it's funny. They see Paul, and they think it's a good thing to kill him. Let's rush him and kill him. But as soon as they see the Romans, they wait a minute, we weren't doing anything. Paul, how are you? Are you doing okay? But it was Claudius who came down and saved Paul, because they would have killed him. So at once he took some soldiers and some centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating him. The commander's name was Claudius Lysensis. That's close enough for government work. I'm terrible with those. But he seems to me to be a decent sort. He saw Paul being beat up. There was a riot starting, and he put it down, and he took Paul. Now, we'll go on. We'll see what he does to him. Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered he be bound with 2 chains, and he began asking who he was and what he had done. Is there a mistake made here? Is there a mistake made here by the commander? Big time. He chained Paul. He not only chained him, he used 2 chains. What can't you do to a Roman citizen? Chain him and beat him. He's going to, later on, he's going to extract the truth from him by scourging him. Well, that'll always work. Yeah, well, later, are you that Egyptian who caused all this trouble?
Yeah, they didn't even consider that he would be a Roman citizen.
Yeah. The first thing he should have done, and what a good policeman would do, is find out where you're from and who you are. And Paul would have told him that he was a Roman citizen. And he was born a Roman citizen. The commander had to buy his, but Paul was a Roman citizen, and then other rules apply. And one of them is you don't chain them, and one of them is you don't beat them. So he sort of jumped the gun there, but we're going to see he sort of makes that up. And he began asking who he was and what he had done. What have you done to deserve this? But among the crowd, some were shouting one thing and some another. And when he could not find out the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks, into the fortress Antonia. And he's going to save his life there. These people wanted him dead. Now the soldiers are going to take him up into the barracks where he could be safe and he could get to the bottom of this. So when he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. As I mentioned before, I think Paul was not a big man. I think Paul was a small man. So it would have been easy to carry him up those stairs, my opinion. And when he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people kept following them, shouting, "Away with this man," or "away with him." This expression, "away with him," does not mean put him in jail. It means get him out of the realm of the physical. Kill him. Just kill him. Did we hear that before? Have we heard that before in the Gospels?
Crucify.
Yeah, crucify him. Don.
I was just considering what language that they were using when they said "away with him," because obviously the commander understood them saying that, so perhaps they were saying away with him in Greek. But when Paul addressed them in Hebrew, obviously the commander didn't understand that, because if he did understand that, he would know what's going on. But then, later on, a ruckus stirred up again, and the commander didn't know anything. So I think that perhaps they said that in Greek because the commander understood
Certainly.
it. But when Paul talked to them in Hebrew, I don't believe the commander knew anything of what he was saying. Yeah. So the commander obviously did not know Hebrew.
It also showed the commander that the guy he was dealing with was not the village idiot. He was an intelligent man. So in verse 33, it says, "Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains." Oops. And he began asking him who he was and what he had done. But among the crowd, some were shouting one thing and some another. And when he could not find out the facts because of the uproar, he ordered to be taken away. And they yelled, "Away with him!" They wanted him dead. You know, I could disagree with someone. Like when I was growing up, I disagreed with my brothers every day. But I never thought about taking their life. These guys disagreed with Paul, didn't like what he had to say, and their only answer is, kill him. Then the command, verse 33, then the commander, oh no, wait a minute, change the thing here, okay. But as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek?" "Well, as a matter of fact, I do." "Then you are not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness." Now that was, you can read about that. If you've got a copy of Josephus, it's in book 20, chapter 8, verse 171. I looked it up. There was an Egyptian. And there were all these false Christs. And he got 4,000 men to follow him. And they went out in the desert and the Romans slaughtered them. The Egyptian got away. Are you that guy? He's asking him, are you this Egyptian guy who had the 4,000 guys killed and you got away? Is that you? But Paul said, "I'm a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city. And I beg you, allow me to speak to the people." And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the stairs, motioned to the people with his hands. And when there was a great hush, he spoke to them in the Hebrew dialect. The commander might have known that if Paul said, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia," he might have known, or at least made a good guess, that this guy was a Roman citizen. A city of no insignificance. Josephus said, by the way, that Tarsus was a beautiful city, well kept, very pretty.
Say, Bill.
So Paul,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
I don't know. I think I'd be, after they were trying to kill me by beating on me like that, I would say, "Oh, I'm rescued. Get me out of here." But that's not what he did. He says,
Nope.
"I want to speak to them." And so he just never gave up that courage to just do what the Lord wanted him to do and represent the gospel to him.
Yeah.
Even after getting beat on just a few minutes ago.
Paul said, "I am ready to go to Jerusalem and be put in jail and killed if necessary for the Lord." So he was focused, single-minded, that I am going to do the Lord's will, and what happens, happens. So he spoke to him in the Hebrew dialect. And when he had given permission, Paul standing up, yeah, that's it, the Hebrew dialect. And it was a special kind of dialect. So there was more than one. What he spoke was it's pronounced Sinai-Chaldesic. So that was the language that Paul spoke, and that's the language that these guys heard. So now he has their attention. And through all of this, by the way, has Paul shown any sign of violence? Is he like Chuck Norris and going to take them all on? No. No, he has shown to be a gentleman. And with that, we're out of time. According to this clock, it's 12:19, so we can go home now. So, thank you for your input and your patience. May God bless each and every one of you.